Hey guys, John here. So the biggest question I always get when I do these courses is where can I get access to the source code? So I obviously can't upload that here on YouTube, so I've made that available for you over on BitTorrent. And along with the source code, you'll also be able to actually download the videos to your computer so you can have them forever. So if for some reason something crazy happened and I decided to delete them, or YouTube kicked me off of their site or whatever, it wouldn't really matter for you because you would have all the source code, you'd have all the videos, everything essentially that I've created for the course you would have on your own computer. So I've created a link in the description where you can find that stuff over on BitTorrent. Please consider going over there, supporting me that way. I'd appreciate that. Also, please consider making a donation here on YouTube using the fan funding. This is how, or one of the ways that I'm able to keep all of the videos that I'm doing and releasing here on YouTube for free, by those who are able to pitching in and allowing me to do that. So please consider that. And if you need access to any of the resources that I use through everything that I do online, coding, releasing videos, etc., you can head on over to johnmorrisonline.com/resources, and I have a whole slew of all sorts of different resources, from hosting to different tutorials and just everything over there that I use. So again, johnmorrisonline.com/resources. All right, on to the lesson.
Hey, John Morris here, and in this video we're going to talk about how to set up your database tables manually. Now, the reason I'm showing you this is because I know that, again, with my conversations with coders and people that that I've worked with and who've seen my videos and stuff, I know that there's certain people that are building their applications for one website. So you're not building an application that you're going to release to the world. You're really just building your application for you, and so in that case, a lot of times you're going to be managing your database manually using PHPMyAdmin. So I want to cover that also, because even if you are going to release your plugin to other people and you need some sort of script to generate your tables dynamically, it still is very helpful to understand how it's done manually. Okay, so that's what I'm going to cover in this video, and that's kind of a lead into the next video, which is obviously how to create them dynamically. But before we dive into the actual how-to of to create tables, one thing I want to talk about is your field types. Now, this is somewhat related to what we're talking about in this video, but it's kind of the best place that I can put this, and it's something that I want to talk about because I know for me, when I was learning, when I was first learning how to code, and even, a little bit to this day, because I don't spend a lot of time, creating fancy MySQL tables. Usually the stuff I do is pretty basic in terms of database structure, which is good. That's the way you want to do it. But again, it's just something that I know when I was learning, it was kind of confusing, and it can make you look at MySQL or make you look at PHPMyAdmin and kind of feel like I don't really know what's going on. So I just want to talk about it so you don't feel that way, and kind of give you just some of the big things that you want to look at when you're creating your fields. So as we go through and we look, I'm looking at the structure section of the WP post table. So this is going to give me information about each column, and that's what we want to do. And of course, we have our names over here, and you'll see this when we get into actually creating these manually. You have to specify these things, which is kind of why I want to talk about it. You also have the type, you have the collation, you have attributes, whether it's null or not, the default, any extras, which auto increment is usually the one that you're going to be concerned with there. Okay, what I want to talk about is I want to talk about the field types. Now you'll notice here that there's kind of some overall basic types. So we have our int types. So we have Bigint. I think all these are Bigint. Yeah, so all these are Bigint. We have our text types, So we have long text, we have text down here. Sometimes you'll see medium text. Sometimes, although less rarely, you'll see tiny text. I don't see tiny text in there as much. But you have your text types, you have your date time types. So you see we have date time here, we have date time here. And then you have your varchar types. So sometimes people can get fused about what type should I use where, okay? So overall, what you want to do is you want to use, integer types for things that are going to be specifically integers. You want to use, again, the text types for things that are going to be specifically text. You want to use date time types for things that are going to be date and time. That allows you, when you write your queries later, to be able to query the MySQL database in the way that's meant to be queried. Okay, it also provides you some built-in protection against someone who might try to attack your database. So for example, let's say that you have your post author set as a string or set as text or maybe varchar or whatever, and but what you're actually putting in there is integers. You're putting in the ID of the author, like we do here in WordPress. Well, if you have it set as a text type, then it's possible for someone to actually enter text into that field. Okay, so they may be able to compromise your database and actually enter text into that field. And it could be text that helps further compromise your database somehow. Now, if you set that field as an integer and someone tries to insert text into it, it won't allow it. It's not going to let it do that. It has to be in the right format. Okay, so formatting your fields properly is kind of a built-in security check that you can use. Now, again, it's very basic. It's not going to keep someone from necessarily compromising your database, but it's important to do that. So because your database is ultimately where everything is going when it comes to your application. So you want to make sure that you do everything you possibly can to keep it from getting compromised. Also, when it comes to creating queries, using the right types allows MySQL to perform more quickly because it's being used in the way that it was meant to be used. Okay, so most people don't have a lot of confusion when it comes to the integer types. You understand that it's an integer that goes in an integer type. Maybe you'll see here this is Bigint and it has 20. So a lot of times that's what you're going to see. In fact, if you see all of these here, most of these are 20, 20, 20, 20. I guess we have an int 11 here. Now, I don't want you to get too wrapped up with the Bigint because, again, a lot of people think when they see that 20 that that's a limit. That's not actually a limit. It just essentially means that anything short of 20 is going to be left padded with zeros. So again, for numbers like IDs and authors where you're going to have, you may have a lot of records or whatever, then you can just use Bigint for that. So again, most people don't get super confused with the int ones or the date time ones because we understand that that's a date time. You just need to put it in MySQL format. Even the text ones kind of make sense. Now you'll notice here that for the title we're using for PostTitle we're using text, and excerpt which we're using text, which essentially just has a shorter limit to the amount of characters that can be entered there compared to something like long text, which is what we use for the PostContent. So the difference between those is essentially comes down to storage capacity, and that makes sense for a title. We're not expecting to have the same amount of content or the same amount of characters as we would for the actual content of a post. Same with the excerpt, especially since with WordPress it's actually limiting the excerpt. So the one that I think confused people the most, one I know I was kind of like, what is this varchar? So the difference between really the kind of information that can be stored in, say, text or varchar is the same. So it's not like int or date time, where if you don't format it correctly, it's not going to store it. You can store arbitrary text in both varchar and text, or long text or medium text or whatever. The difference between the two has to do with how it's stored. So varchar is essentially stored in line in the database, whereas text fields are stored are not stored in line, and what's stored is essentially a pointer to where that text is actually stored on the server. So what that means is that generally, if you're going to retrieve a text field, it's going to take a little bit longer. It's going to require a little bit more resources because it has to get that field, look for the pointer, and then go actually grab the content. So whereas varchar being stored in line, it can just grab it right there. The problem is that with MySQL, there's maximums to how many characters can be stored per row, and so on and so forth. So if you have a field that's going to have a lot of text, or could have a lot of text, then you generally want to use your text fields like text and long text and medium text. Whereas if you have you're going to have a field where the content is going to be predictably short. So for example, the post status. The statuses that WordPress has are published, or publish. These are the actual values: published, draft, scheduled, I believe. So those are predictably short. We know that they're going to be short, so there's no problem storing them in line. Whereas with the content, we don't know what that's going to be. It could be very long. Same with the title. We know it's not going to be as long as content, but it still could be pretty long. Same with the excerpt. Okay, so that's essentially the difference between the two. You'll notice where in here where there's fields where it could be arbitrarily long text, where we don't really know if it's going to be long or not. There's text fields that are used, whereas things that are predictably short, varchar is being used. So the status, there's only a certain number of statuses that can go in here, and they're all short. The comment status, ping status, post password, we assume is probably going to be short. The post name is essentially a slug, which we again assume is going to be pretty short. The GUID again is essentially a URL, so again we can kind of assume that's going to be pretty short. The post type, so that could be post, it could be page, it could be a custom post type name, but again that's going to be predictably short. So where you have a field that's going to contain content that is going to be short, that's again, for all intents and purposes, is going to be pretty short, you can go ahead and use varchar, and then that's going to help you with performance. Whereas if you're just not sure and you kind of assume that it might be longer or could be longer, then you would want to use text fields like we're using here. Okay, so when we get into actually setting up the fields, this is an important part because you actually have to make these decisions in terms of what field types am I going to use. Okay, so I just wanted to cover that a little bit. Again, I'm not going to go into great depth about that, because I think understanding the basic kind of the pieces about how to put that together is all you really need for most of what you're going to do. Now, if you get heavy into where you really need to have specific field types and you need to know all the ins and outs, then I would say, probably go in and dig in and learn and figure all that stuff out. But for most of what you're going to do, you can just follow those general guidelines that I covered. All right, so that said, let's go ahead and go in and actually create some tables and create some fields. All right, so what we're going to do is we're actually going to just kind of go back to the home, and I want to show you how to first create a database. So If we head over here to databases, then we can create a database. You can select the collation, so whatever it happens to be for your particular needs, you can select that here. I'm just going to hit create and leave it as it is. So that created our database that we're looking for, MySQL demo. So we'll come over here to that database, and now we can create tables. Okay, so I'm gonna first, again, we talked about before in the first video in the how to structure your database. We talked about the different types of tables that you might have: an object table, a meta table, and a relationships table. So those are the three kinds of tables I want to show you how to create. So the first one I'm going to show you how to create is an object table. Okay, so I'm just going to call this table objects so it's easy for us to remember. And in this table, I'm just going to create 5 fields, and you'll see why I'm creating 5. For your application, again, you'll kind of want to map all this out, and you'll know exactly how many number of columns you need. So to create the table, I just entered that information and I hit go, and now it's going to give me the interface to be able to create the actual fields. So the first one that I'm going to create is an ID field. Essentially, every table you create is going to have an ID like this. This essentially becomes like your key for that table. So every record that's in this table is going to have an ID associated with it. That makes it just a lot easier to create relationships between tables, to be able to create a meta table that you can associate by ID, to be able to query for things. It just makes everything a lot easier. It's pretty much required. I mean, it's not required by MySQL, but for your application and your database structure, it's really something that you need to do. All right, so for this, we're just going to use Bigint. We'll do 20. The default, we'll leave it none. The collation, we won't worry about. The attributes, we're going to put it unsigned. Now you might wonder why we put this as unsigned. Essentially what this means is that when you make this field unsigned, it means it can never be negative. So for our ID that we're gonna have auto increment, that's pretty important. We don't want this field to ever be a negative number. Okay, so if we didn't put this, it could possibly be a negative number. Again, we don't want to, that would basically essentially break our application. It wouldn't make sense for what we're doing, so we don't want to allow it. Okay, so we're going to put it as unsigned so we can never have a negative number. Leave the null unchecked because this can't have a null value. Here we're going to put the primary key because this is going to be the primary key for this database, and we're going to select this to make it auto increment. So it's going to automatically increment every time a record is added to this database, which is what we want. All right, the second field that we're going to create, I'm going to call PostTitle. We're going to just assume that we're going to model a CMS here. Okay, so for PostTitle, we're going to go with text. For the length and value, we're not going to set anything. For the default, we're not going to have a default. For the collation, I'm just going to let that be. Attributes, let that be. Null, we're going to let that be. And the index, we're going to let that be. And auto increment. Okay, so that's essentially all we need to set there is the post title and the type. Okay, next we're going to do the post content, and under that we are going to do long text because this could potentially store a lot of text in it. Again, for this, we're not going to worry about any of the rest of the values on here. Those are really the only two that we're concerned with at this point. All right, for the next field, I'm going to go with PostName. This is essentially our slug. And so for here, this is where we will want to use something, where's that? There it is, like varchar, and we'll put in our 20 here. And essentially, yeah, the rest of these can just stay the way they are, okay? So this is something that we know is going to be predictably short. Now, here is where, you know, depending on what this field is, you may have a default here. So for example, if you look at the post name table in the WordPress database, you'll notice that the default is a string publish. So the default, if nothing's passed to this field and a record is created, the default is to publish, which makes sense because in WordPress, it makes sense to have the default status of the post to be published. That's generally what most people do or want to do when they're publishing or when they're submitting a post as a record to the database, is they want it published. Again, depending on your application, that may or may not make sense, and it also depends on the field. Of course, for post name, that doesn't actually make sense because we don't have a default slug. We're going to generate the slug based off of the title. The last one that we're going to do is post date. And so this is the date of the post, and we're going to use then a date time type here. All right, so we're going to use a date time here. And essentially for this one, that's all we're really concerned with. Okay, so we don't really need to worry about the rest of these fields. All right, so we have our ID, our title, our content, our slug, and our date. Now again, for your application, you may have more fields, you may have less fields, but that gives you an idea of how to actually create the tables in your database and some of the reasoning behind why you might use different types of data and the different values that you would set and why, based off what kind of fields you have. Right, so what we'll do now is we'll go ahead and save that. And that has now created our table. So if we go into our table, you can see that here under the structures tab, because we don't have any records, you'll see that we have our table created here. Right, so that's exactly what we needed for our object table. The next type of table that we want to create is we're going to create a meta table. So we'll go ahead and come over here to create table. And we're going to go ahead and enter our values in the fields that it's provided here. So you'll notice at the top we have table name. So we're going to go, we'll just do object meta, okay? And then we're going to create the different fields. So the first one, again, is going to be ID. Now, one thing to keep in mind here, and again, I don't want to get too advanced, like too complicated here, but if you're working with constraints, so what a constraint allows you to do is it allows you to, for example, let's say that you create a meta table and you're associating meta to different posts. Well, let's say you delete a post. Well, if you delete a post just from the post table, that's not going to actually delete any of the metadata that's associated with it automatically, because you would actually have to go through and write your code to do that. Or you can use what's called a constraint, and essentially what that constraint will allow you to do is if it makes it so that a field can only exist in a table based off some sort of condition. So what a lot of people use them for is you can constrain the fields in a meta table based off of what's in the actual object table. So if a post gets deleted in the object table, then the meta table is essentially going to dump all of the records in the meta table that was associated with that object ID. All right. So I tell you all of that because when you write constraints, having two different tables that have the same column name can get a little bit confusing. So that's why if you look at, for example, the WordPress database, they use meta ID. Now, again, I don't actually know why they specifically do it. I haven't actually ever read if that's, or really looked into if that's exactly why they do it. But I know from my experience, that's one of the reasons why people do it, is so it's not so confusing. So you're not writing a constraint with a reference to a bunch of fields with the exact same name. They just happen to be in different tables. Okay, so we're going to do meta ID here just so for that reason, just to kind of show you best practice or whatever. All right, so for the meta ID, then we're going to want to use our Bigint 20. And again, for this, we want to have it unsigned. We want to have it auto increment. Okay. And then for the next field, this is essentially going to be our object ID. So this is going to reference the objects in our objects table by ID. So that's where we're going to put this. Looks like I missed. And again, for this, we're going to use Bigint. Use 20. We're going to make it unsigned, but we won't auto increment it, obviously, because we're going to populate it with the actual value. For the next field, we're going to do meta key. And for this one, because a meta key is generally going to be predictably short, because you're not going to want to have some big long meta key that you're trying to query for. So we're going to do our, actually it's at the top of our char, 255, because it could be a little bit, it could be a little bit longer. Null, in this particular case, you actually can allow null here. Probably won't be, but you can allow that here. And then for our meta value, we're going to go with long text. This can actually be null as well, because the value of this could be null. Okay, so and actually the defaults here will be null as well. Okay, so that's kind of how we can set up a meta table here. Again, we have the actual ID of this record in the database. We have the object ID, which is from our objects table that this metadata is attached to. We have the key for that metadata, and then we have the value. All right, so we'll go ahead and save that. And that creates our object meta table. All right, so the last table that we're then going to create, or the type of table that we're going to create, is a relationships table. All right, so we'll go ahead and hit create table. Now, usually when you do this, you reference the two objects that are going to come together. Okay, so, you know, I work for Wishlist Products. We sell a product called Wishlist Member. So one of the relationships tables that we have is called content levels. So it essentially puts a relationship between content and levels. We also have user levels, which puts users into levels. Okay, and that's essentially how a protection system works. But in this particular case, we'll just do object tags. Okay, so we'll just say that this is a relationships table for objects and tags. All right, so the first the first record again here is going to be our ID. We'll do Bigint 20 just like we always do. And we'll make it unsigned, and we'll make it auto increment. Now, it is possible to do this and not actually have that ID field in there, because sometimes because you'll see here in a minute, it can make it a little bit more confusing. And usually in the case of relationships tables, you don't necessarily need an ID, because you're always gonna, for a relationship table, you're gonna be querying the two different objects that are being related. You'll rarely ever query the actual ID of this object. However, I'm just gonna leave it in kind of to give you kind of a standard, but if you kind of felt like you didn't need it or wanted to remove it, you could actually do that in this particular case. All right, so in this case, the next thing we're gonna do is our next field is gonna be our object ID. So this is going to be the ID of our one of our objects, which is, in this case, we're just calling objects. So the object ID is going to be, again, pretty similar. Bigint 20. Again, we want this unsigned because it's not going to be negative. And we can leave the rest of this. Okay, so that's the object ID. Then we would have our tag ID. So this is the ID of our tag that we're connecting with this object. So we'll go again, Bigint 20, unsigned, because this cannot be, again, we don't want it to be able to be negative. And that's actually all we're going to use here. We don't really need anything else for this, because we're just essentially tying two objects together. Now, there are scenarios where you may need another field. For example, with wish list member, we have an auto load field that can be set to yes or no. With WordPress, they have a term order. That doesn't really apply with what we're doing here, and a lot of times in your applications it probably won't apply. So just going to leave this how it is. All right, so that's our fields. We'll go ahead and hit save there. So now we have our objects, we have our object meta, and we have our object tags. And so that gives us all of the three different fields, different types of fields that you may create when creating a database, and that's how to create them all manually.